Hi everyone, this is Counseling 2250, Robinson Wood, Chapter 7, People of African Descent. And as I have said before in previous chapters, this book is introducing us to the various different types of ethnicities. Not everything here is going to be 100% accurate with the population that we're talking about. These are generalizations through research and stuff like that. Okay, all right, so let's start off with history 500 to 1500 AD. One of the earliest human skeletal remains were found in Africa. They're also one of the areas that also had a lot of earliest bones, I would say would be Asia as well. In Africa, first to use tools, paint pictures, plant seeds, and worship gods. Between 500 and 1600 AD, Africa had empires, governments, systems of trade throughout the continent. Ghana dominated for 300 years in the 11th century was when they had their peak. Mali in the 13th century was at their peak, and there was Songhai, which is 15th and 16th centuries were where their peak was. Each had kings, abundant with gold, agriculture, manufacturing, and international trading. There are a lot of resources, and so other people would come, travelers would come, and basically were able to then basically trade goods and stuff like that. Timbuktu was considered one of the world's greatest cities to ever have existed. Now let's talk about the slave trade. Obviously, if there are people who are of African descent with many generations in America, most likely they came from slavery. All right, majority of Black people in America can trace their ancestry to the Caribbean, and basically that is because of the slave trade. Slave trade existed for over 400 years. 1501, the Spanish government authorized the use of African slaves in America. Portugal was the first country to bring African slaves to the Americas and traded slaves for gold, salt, sugar, wine, and tobacco. In 2010, Sao Jose Paquete ship found in the Cape of Good Hope left from Mozambique in 1794 for Brazil with 500 African slaves. And bodies of half of those slaves were still in the shipwreck that was found. The slave trade consisted of people from Portuguese, Spanish, Dutch, British, and American colonies. Those are basically the ones who were dealing in slavery. 60,000 voyages that took between 60 days to 4 months. So what that is basically saying is basically people in ships going from Africa to the different countries, the destinations, took from 60 days to 4 months. It's hard for us to imagine that because now we can hop on a plane or a train and get there in a matter of days or hours. Whereas before on a ship, you have to think about being on a boat basically in the ocean, going to the destination that they need to go to. And those destinations consisted of Cuba, Europe, West Indies, South America, and of course the American colonies. 12 million Africans were brought to the Americas, 2 million died during transport. Kidnapped were royalty, merchants, and the poor. Mainly from West and Central Africa, just because if you look at it, West Africa is close to the United States, right? So these are the different countries where slaves came from. The Hausas, the Mandingos, the Yorubas, the Efiks, the Crooks, the Ashantis, the Dahomeyans, Senegalese, and Fantins. I apologize if I misenunciate any of these words. Some Africans played a role in capturing other Africans for sale to white slave traders. So you'll probably hear when people debate about slavery, they'll say something like, but the African people basically had slaves as well, right? But here's the thing that we need to also pay attention to when it comes to the detail, is that prior, slavery did exist in Africa, but there were two very distinct differences, okay? African slavery was not plantation or mining slavery. They did not strip people from their family linkage and was not due to racial hatred, made them to feel inferior or consider them basically subhuman. Whereas in the slavery in the Americas and in other new worlds, basically, Africans were actually seen as subhuman. So there's a difference right there. The other thing is that African slavery would also sometimes marry, own property, and become members of the family. So there was that shift, right? People are still people and seen as people, whereas with the colonizers, they treated slaves differently. Okay, and also note: be careful of people overemphasizing the degree of African involvement. Although some Africans were greedy and allowed white slave traders for weapons, many, such as King Alamami and Captain Toba, forbid slavery. In 1619 was when the first African settlers reached Jamestown, Virginia. Not seen as slaves, but were to work off the fee for travel to America. So it's kind of like this thing called indentured servitude, where basically you help me, let's say, come to America, so I'm going to work off that loan, basically, or the costs that it would have cost me to pay to actually come to America. They were free to move around in America for about 40 years, but then the slave trade became popular. In 1527, the first African explorer of the Americas was Estevanico from Morocco and was a slave of Andres Dorantes, basically the person first to discover New Mexico, and was killed by Zuni Indians protecting their land. Also in the late 1700s, Native Americans also owned African slaves. The Cherokees were the people who owned the most amount of slaves when you are comparing them with all the other tribes, such as the Choctaws, Seminoles, and then the Creeks. Okay, so now that you're learning about this, you're going to understand that our history is very messy, right? And sometimes in previous history books that you have learned through, maybe didn't really mention all these things, or were more general and more less, traumatic. But again, history is very, very traumatic. In 1808, slave trade is outlawed in the United States, 1 million slaves at that time. And then in 1860, 4 million slaves existed. The highest amount of slaves existed in Virginia, but also in Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Texas, Louisiana, Tennessee, and Arkansas. So you can sort of see right there that a lot of them were in the South. Now let's talk about the resistance to slavery. In 1526, slaves set fire to their settlement in South Carolina and lived among the Native Americans. So the Spanish granted them their freedom. Frances E.W. Harper was a black poet and was born to free blacks in Maryland. In 1854, she wrote a book called Poems of Miscellaneous Subjects, and I'm going to read you some of her well-known lines. And mothers stood with streaming eyes and saw their dearest children sold. Unheeded rose their bitter cries, while tyrants bartered them for gold. So again, we're talking about how mothers were able to witness their own children being sold into slavery. Slavery was supported by the government and sanctioned by the Christian church. Sanctioned basically means allowing it to exist. Therefore, mental health, self-image, psyches, and their earning potential can never be truly assessed. So what that is basically saying is it existed back then and it's still happening now, which is why sometimes people don't see it, because it's existed for so long that we don't know how to write these things, because it's been generations upon generations upon generations of people who thought this specific way, that associate black people with slavery and never being able to treat them as equals. Okay. There is this thing called hush harbors, which is basically them inventing languages and signals as slaves, African rhythms, singing, beliefs with evangelical Christianity, and of course Negro spirituals as well. In 1863, Abraham Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation, which basically freed the slaves in the South because the North didn't want slaves helping the South during the Civil War. So when we hear about Abraham Lincoln and doing this, there was a reason why. It wasn't just because, hey, I just want to free slaves. It was because they were about to basically fight in a war and they didn't want to have so many people fighting against the North, because then, they potentially could lose, right? So this is one aspect to it. And June 19th, 1865, also known as Juneteenth, slavery outlawed in Texas. December 18, 1865, slavery became illegal, and that was the 13th Amendment of the United States Constitution. So right here, I hyperlinked it so that you can actually see the document and read more about it if you choose to do so, about the 13th Amendment. To have opportunities, African Americans had to move to the North. And Maryland was the border of the South and the North, so many people actually settled there. And you can still see today in Maryland, there is a large amount of people who are considered Black or African American. And because of this migration and outlawing of slavery, the Ku Klux Klan started organizing in certain areas to terrorize the African Americans. The KKK would go unpunished because governments would have KKK members working in different positions. So that would be in, let's say, the police department or in law. And so this is the reason why we still have that today, or we talk about it still today, the fact that systemically there are many people who are part of government or people who decide about power are actually part of the KKK. 14th Amendment in 1864 extended citizenship to African Americans. So now they're able to become citizens. And the 15th Amendment allowed African Americans to vote. By law, segregation replaced slavery, and this was also known as Jim Crow. And you'll hear the word Jim Crow or the phrase Jim Crow even today, right? And basically why, although it's one step better than slavery, it's not that great still. Because what it means is separation but equal. So Black people, you can go about, but you have to stay away from the white people. That's basically what it's saying. African Americans had to ride in the back of the bus, sit in different sections of movie theaters, drink at separate water faucets, live in separate neighborhoods, and eat in separate restaurants. Again, separate but equal. So it's not really being welcoming, right? Conditions for African American resources were poorly managed or provided compared to the European Americans. Most African Americans live in the South, but moved to the North during World War I and World War II due to manufacturing jobs. So in here you can see on the slide, no dogs, Negroes, and Mexicans. So you can see how Mexicans and Negro or African Americans basically were seen as not equal to Caucasian or white people, right? Or restrooms. White is on one side, colored or basically African American on the other side, or colored seated in the rear, okay? Basically means sitting in the back. Now let's talk about demographic trends. Second largest minority group in the US with 45.7 million people, 13.2%. And then there's Africa, Haiti, which has the second highest population of African immigrants, the Dominican Republic, Jamaica, which has the highest population of African immigrants, Central Europe, and North and South America. African American people live in New York, Florida, Georgia, Texas, California, Illinois, North Carolina, Maryland, Virginia, and Louisiana. Much of the recent growth in America are African immigrants. In 2010, 55% lived in the South, 18% lived in the Midwest, 17% lived in the Northeast, and 10% lived in the West. Now let's talk about social, psychological, and physical health issues. In 2010, the median age was about 37.2. African American women are the least likely to be married, especially during childbearing years. Women outnumber men in every decade. 35% in non-family households, living alone or with unrelated roommates. 30% are women-only households. 29% are married couples, and 6% are male-only households. Grandparents are more likely to live with and care for grandchildren. Higher rates of marital divorce, separation, or never married. And intermarried, basically interracial marriage, is on the rise, males more than the females. In 2013, poverty rates for African Americans was 27%. US is typically 14.5, so it's a lot higher. More likely to be exposed to violence such as child abuse, sexual abuse, drug overdose, and AIDS, HIV. Results in PTSD and depression. 18% had no health insurance to help, less access to mental health services as well, reluctance to seek mental health services because of stigma and mental health, less likely to be properly diagnosed, so overdiagnosing of schizophrenia, even though they might not, people may assume that they have it, or professionals do and diagnose them that way, less likely to get the correct medication as well. So you can see there's a reason why African Americans or Black people don't necessarily trust medical doctors or the government, right? And one really famous one is called the Tuskegee experiment. And I just linked right here a quick little video that explains it in 3 minutes, 2.5, 3 minutes, about the Tuskegee experiment. You'll hear about it happening a lot right now, or you'll hear them referring to this during 2020 with the pandemic, because one of the areas of COVID testing that they do not have a lot of is volunteers who are African American or just people of color are not really volunteering to help do studies, right? And there's a reason why. And this one is actually one of the most famously referenced experiments or events that treated African Americans very, very poorly. High school graduation levels, 80% for 25 years and older, 17% have bachelor's degree. Employment, sales and office jobs are very good. Service occupations are also very popular, construction jobs, and production and transportation. In 2010, African American males 6 times more likely to be in prison compared to Caucasian men. There are many single female households due to African men being incarcerated, underemployed, unemployed, and unskilled. So the difference between underemployed and unemployed, because I want to make sure you know the difference, underemployed basically means that you're not making minimum wage. You're actually making a lot less than that. And unemployed means you have no job at all. So when we talk about health, things that influence people's health are smoking and nutrition, right? And those things may cause or influence stroke, obesity, cigarette smoking, prostate cancer, HIV/AIDS, infant mortality, depression is high, diabetes, high cholesterol, and hypertension. Now let's talk about physical appearance. Skin color has social power and status within the African American community. Lighter skin bolsters a family's social position over time. Research says that skin color hue affects income, educational attainment, perception of success. Also, body shape, facial features, and hair texture also influences that well. So basically what this is saying is if you have lighter skin or you're more European looking, with European features, let's say, that you're perceived as more beautiful, more intelligent, and all that other stuff. And we saw that with the Latinx and Native American communities as well. Remember when we saw people who were basically trying to lighten groups of people by having people come over and intermixing so that their skin color would be lighter and lighter and lighter. And that's basically trying to get rid of darker skinned people, right? There's a really good documentary that I hyperlinked to. It's a great trailer called Dark Girls Documentary. And the documentary itself is really good. I've seen it, and I encourage you guys to all go see it as well. And it talks about, skin bleaching, which is something that actually happens a lot with many different people of color, because again, all the minorities believe that or think that or are taught that lighter skin is more beautiful. Colorism. African American women remember being told by mothers that they could not go outside until their hair was pressed and curled or braided. So the message right there is that you don't look presentable. So then we see many African American women straightening their hair to make it look more European instead of having like curly kinky hair, and celebrating that. Preference, again, lighter skin tones over darker skin tones like we discussed before, rooted in the social, political, and economic conditions that have existed since slavery. So again, a lot of the things that we deal with today when it comes to one group thinking that they're better than the other has existed for hundreds of years. Lighter skinned African Americans could work in the house. Male slave owners raped African American women with mixed babies as a result. So you start to see that intermingling. I hear, or I'm sure you have all heard about Thomas Jefferson having a child who is of mixed race, right? And a lot of times they say, oh yeah, it's a romance between him and one of his slaves. But the reality is that he most likely raped her. Okay. Again, this is how history gets changed sometimes. And then we're like, oh yeah, it was like a happy, side, affair or whatever, and stuff like that. But no, most likely it is rape. Too black and not black enough comes into play. Predominantly black universities pay attention to skin color more than predominantly white universities. So now we're talking about seeing within our own group, basically, or within the African American group, that people are being more judgmental to each other. Um, Unhealthy methods of coping with racism is adopting hairstyles to look more white, discriminating against darker skinned African Americans by other African Americans. Again, and that's very sad, right? You're pitting one against each other when it really shouldn't be that way, but it happens because of the way that people have been influenced by society. Now let's talk about cultural orientations and values. Common cultural values are oral traditions, so basically telling stories through word of mouth, reliance on proverbial wisdom, spirituality and faith, firm child rearing practices, education as a means of self-help, collateral interpersonal relations, so basically being able to communicate with each other, formal communication styles with elders and authority figures, so there's a respect for people who are older. And then of course, respect for elders and the authority figures. They're very related. Nonverbal modes of communication, so there's more body language going on. Extended family based on blood and strong ties. Unity and cooperation, resistance, purpose, creativity, and fluid time orientation. So that means, time isn't as important, like exact time, like being somewhere exactly at 8 o'clock or something like that. So despite struggles and hardships, there is still a value of spirituality, persistence, forgiveness, resistance, humor, wisdom, and resilience. So even though this population has experienced a lot of trauma, they also still have things that are very hopeful and positive, right? And of course, that's how people are able to survive, right? Is to be able to have hope in times of trauma. And so you'll see many people very deeply connected to spirituality as a response. Maintaining a strong connection with the church represents a foundation for the experience of most African Americans. Even if there's no church home or they don't go to church, they still pray to the Lord. Black churches played a point of advocacy in social and political change. The church played a role in the civil rights movement, voter registration, fundraising for college students, health promotion, personal and spiritual development. So you can see the church plays a major role in the community, right? And so when people have problems, they will go to the church to talk it out and see if they can network and help each other out that way. Musicians and celebrities nurtured by participating in choir, youth programs, and leadership forums that you'll see that are created or housed in churches. When it comes to religion, many African Americans adopt the Christian belief. There's African Methodist Episcopal, Jehovah Witnesses, Church of God in Christ, Seventh-day Adventist, Pentecostal. There's also Islamists, Buddhists, Jews, and agnostics. And agnostic basically means not believing, let's say, in a God. Okay, now we're talking about communication patterns, right? They're not limited to just verbal dialogue or standard English. So you'll hear people say, Ebonics, right, as a language, or a language that comes from, let's say, English. And I don't think that you should put down Ebonics at all, right? It's just a cultural language that came off of English, right? It's not good, it's not bad. I don't think people should, and I hope that you guys don't make fun of people who speak Ebonics at all, because this is part of the culture, okay? Well, dealing with injustice and things that are ludicrous, sense of humor, right? Having a good sense of humor when you have trauma helps you survive. Nonverbal modes of communication patterns, how something is said rather than what is actually said. And you actually see that a lot with memes, right? GIFs and memes. You'll see that actually a lot of them are of people who are African American because of their body language is so interesting, fascinating, unique, eye-catching, funny. There's many words to it, right? But there's also people who are pushing back on that and saying, why are we always making people who are black into, let's say, kind of caricatures, exaggerated movements and stuff like that in these memes and gifs. So again, the body movement, posture, gesture, and facial expressions are notable, right, in American society. And of course, there's going to be people who are going to go, no, that's not good. And then there are people who are like, no, that's fine because it's part of our culture. Fluid relationship with time, basically meaning that something may formally start at a specific time and some may arrive later. Okay, there is a phrase called CPT, right? And I'm just going to say it because I want you to know what it means when someone does refer to it. But I personally would not recommend you just using this anywhere, which is basically colored people time. CPT, right? And just to understand that this is a potentially cultural difference, and that's it, right? And to be able to be aware of it and not necessarily punish people who might be 10 minutes late, 5 minutes late, or whatever it is. It actually happens in various different types of people of color. Different cultural groups will also have a very unique relationship when it comes to time. All right, let's talk about Afrocentricity, which basically means Africa as the center, right? Worldview that believes that reality is both spiritual and material at once, the highest value of positive interpersonal relationships between men and women. Self-knowledge is assumed to be the basis of all knowledge, and knowing through symbolic imagery and rhythm. So there's a proverb that the book talks about, says, I am because we are, and since we are, therefore I am, right? It's beautiful. There's also consubstantiation, which is a sense that everything within the universe is connected as a part of a whole. So you can sort of see this cultural, spiritual idea about existence on the planet, right? And so this is one of those things that we're talking about. And you saw that with Native Americans as well, with one with nature. And you will also see that with Asians when it comes to, like, let's say, the yin and yang or harmony with nature as well. All right, so now let's talk about different types of cultural values when it comes to African Americans or people of African descent. There's Nguzo Saba, which is a classical African values. Nguzo Saba is basically Swahili for the 7 pillars. So the 7 pillars are basically 7 principles, okay? So principle 1 is umoja, which is unity and collective work. Principle 2 is kujichagalia, which is self-determination and naming for the self who the self will be despite others' definition. So another way to say that is self-determination. Okay. The third principle is ijima or ujima, which is responsibility, solidarity, harmony, cooperation, and connection with others towards a common destiny. The fourth principle is ujamaa, which is cooperative economics, or resources are shared for the good of all. Principle 5 is nia, which is purpose. Benefits not only the self, but the collective for which everyone has a responsibility. Principle 6 is kuumba, which is creativity, leaving the world a better place than it was when you first arrived. And the 7th principle or pillar is imani, which is faith, the past, the present, and the future. So if you've heard of Nguzo Saba, these are the things that basically they believe in, and you'll hear about it, like, let's say, during Kwanzaa and stuff like that. It's really beautiful. I encourage you guys to go and read up more about this basically African values. Now let's talk about resistance theory. And you probably heard a lot of people using the word resist in a lot of the current protests and stuff like that, right? So there's a history behind why people have chosen the word resist. So resistance theory is response to chronic stress and racism. Tools to name, confront, repudiate, and replace dominant and demeaning messages with knowledge of self and community. So what that is saying is, society is very oppressive, but we are not supposed to be oppressed. We should not be oppressed. So let us learn about the values of our culture and celebrate that and really live in that, right? Africa is set apart from other ethnic groups because, number 1, the African legacy is rich in custom and culture. 2, the history of slavery and its insidious attempts to destroy people's souls while keeping their physical bodies in servitude. 3, historical and contemporary racism and sexism. And 4, the victim system in which people are denied access and then blamed for their marginalized position. So you can see, you know, them recognizing African American people, recognizing the fact that they're oppressed, and to actually verbalize it and point out exactly how they're oppressed, but yet they still endure and they resist, and then they move forward and become successful, right? But again, we have to remember there's hundreds of years of oppression and racism and, you know, all that type of horrible stuff that they had to experience. Okay, now let's talk about African American racial identity. So there is this thing called nigrescence, which is Negro to Black conversion experience, transforming from a non-Afrocentric identity to an Afrocentric one. So what that is about this process. This model believes that we're going to leave from becoming basically a westernized type of idea to a more African type of idea. Okay. Most widely used racial theory about African Americans developing healthy racial collective identities as a function a function of discrepancy in socio-political power across racial groups. Again, to remind people who've been so oppressed that actually their history is very rich with wonderful, amazing things, right? But people tend to forget it because over the years, you know, when people deny those things, you sometimes will just give up, right? And just go along with Western culture. The difference between personal identity is self-esteem and interpersonal competence. So personal identity basically means that about how you feel about yourself, right? And how you communicate with other people. Whereas reference group orientation, which is the other phrase, is about racial identity and racial self-esteem. How do we as a group feel about our people? Right, our ethnicity. So there's two sets, right? One is a collective group and one is more of an individual perspective. Identity development is a maturation process where external negative images of the self are replaced with positive internal concepts. Again, we're talking about layers and layers and layers and generations upon generations of people being told, or Black people basically, being told that being Black is awful, but being westernized or white is good, right? And when you're told that all the time, you sometimes just accept it because you give up sometimes, right? So this racial identity that we've been talking about is basically going, no, we must tell our Black children that it is wonderful and amazing to be Black. Okay, so the 5 stages of the process nigrescence is, number 1 is pre-encounter, 2 is encounter, 3 is immersion and then immersion, 4 is internalization, and 5 is internalize and commitment. And I know that sounds really crazy right now because you're like, what does this all mean? We're actually going to explore and define all these things in the next couple of slides. So when we talk about this model of going from Western to more African-centric, right, Afrocentric mentality for people who are Black, the pre-encounter is the acculturated African-American views of the world through the lens of the white dominant culture. Race has no salience, or basically is seen as not important, and see beauty in art from a Eurocentric perspective. So when you're in the pre-encounter, you're not aware about the amazingness of African culture, right? You're like, you know, what white people do is the best, and that's what we accept, right? So that's pre-encounter. Encounter is the result from having a shocking personal experience that is inconsistent with the old. Every year, they experience more and more, let's say, becoming aware of their Black experience. They will internalize these experiences, and then if they go to school and are taught Eurocentric ideas, they may be a delay in this stage. So basically, like, as you get older, you'll probably experience racism more and more, right? Then you're starting to realize, wait a minute, America isn't about, you know, being Black or being Mexican or being Asian or whatever. It's actually white people against people of color, unfortunately, right? But you don't realize that maybe when you're a child or where you were born, but as you live life, you'll start to experience like, wait a minute, being Black is very unfair in America, right? So this is the encounter stage when that happens. There's a shock. Then there is the immersion and immersion. So that's immersion or immersion. So focus on being Black to the exclusion of others, particularly whites. Main focus in life becomes a feeling of togetherness and oneness with people. So this is a time where basically you're going to fill your life with things about Black culture, okay? And you're slowly going to now leave the white culture or the Eurocentric culture. Okay? Internalization is peace and calm. So now you're taking all this information and you're like, let me now sit with it. Let me feel it. Let me see what it's doing with my mind and my body and my soul. So salience attached to blackness. So basically saying we want to now feel the blackness of who we are, right? We are black, so let us feel the blackness. Internalization and commitment is to seek to eradicate racism for all oppressed people, reflective of sustained long-term interest and commitment all through life, not just for a small period in time or life. So what this phase is, now that you are now, let's say Afrocentric, right, or Afrocentric, you're going to want to now help other Black people reach this kind of peace and this celebration of being Black. So that's what it is. So you can see the 5 different steps. And of course, assessment based on nigrescence is called the Cross Racial Identity Scale, or CRIS. And I just want to mention, like, Beyonce is probably celebrated because of her basically kind of like Afrocentric albums, right? She has 2 albums out now that speak about the Black experience in a westernized way that goes slowly towards more African ways. And so you can sort of see this model actually influencing Beyonce and her crew. Now let's talk about the implications for mental health professionals. So this is basically now you, right? Okay, knowledge of the psychological stress that is born of racism and oppression. I'm hoping that through the chapters that you're learning right now, you're starting to learn that each culture experiences racism or prejudice in a different way, right? But to not ignore any of that and not feel uncomfortable talking about it. If you are uncomfortable talking about these things, typically if we were in class, you know, I would ask you guys to talk to each other and share and learn from each other, right? Because no one has all the answers. It's about making friends with other people in college is when you're like, oh, I'm learning about a different culture. And I never realized this because I had so many assumptions and I just thought they were true. But actually, it's very interesting and very eye-opening. Okay, skills to improve mental health outcomes. Hopefully, because you meet and you talk to people, you're going to be able to now have a better toolbox to work with your clients to improve. Able to discuss historical hostility that describes the collective psychology of Black people due to exposure to slavery, discrimination, and fears about unequal treatment. So now, when a person who is Black or African American says, you know, life is so unfair, right? Your response shouldn't be, well, you know, it's only unfair because you want it to be unfair, or you let it be unfair. No, there's actually hundreds of years of inequality for a person who is Black. And so when they say something like that, you need to be able to empathize and go, yeah, I can see what you mean, you know, when you tell me this story. And because of your ethnicity, that makes sense, unfortunately, right? But let's see how we can improve that for your life. Know about Black parents' preparations for the resistance to racism, preparing children for a hostile world, how to survive and thrive in a society where race matters, what kind of clothing to avoid to not be seen as lazy or stereotypical of Black Americans, stay in school to make something of oneself, how to interpret blatant racism so it does not destroy their self-worth. So right here, these are things that some cultures don't have to worry about, right? Do parents have to, did your parents tell you you cannot wear a hoodie because people are going to think that you're going to rob them, right? Not everyone who wears a hoodie is going to be seen as a, let's say, a thug or whatever, right? And unfortunately for people who are Black, they have to tell their children, you know, when you see a police officer, don't put your hands in your pocket because you might get shot, right? And we hear about all this stuff, especially now with all the protests that are going on with Black Lives Matter. And I want you to be able to understand where all of this is coming from. It's not all just all of a sudden, all this stuff is happening. It's actually, again, very, very long generation old, okay? Not to be overwhelmed by the magnitude of sadness of clients' narratives. Again, hey, slavery is an awful experience, right? And we don't want people to just focus on that, though. We want to be able to have them focus on also what the possibility of the future is for them, which could be, well, which is going to be a lot better than, let's say, the history of Black people in America. So for this one, this slide right here is called the Contemporary African American Issues slide. What it is I love to read about cultures all the time. So I wanted to introduce you to some different articles or YouTube videos so that you too can share in with what is going on in contemporary America when it comes to, let's say, African Americans. So the read is an article about two young millennials who are podcasters, and they talk about Black culture. And it's really funny. Do I agree with everything they say? No. But do I agree with some of them? Definitely. And they have a point. They've actually made me think about certain things that I wasn't aware of. So this is why I want to recommend them to you. The term Uncle Tom, you might have heard that. You don't understand what it is. And it comes from literature and how it used to be described as a good thing, but now it's seen as a bad thing. So I want you to read the article so you understand that. And then what happened to Black Lives Matter? So this article is actually a little bit older, and what it is the first wave of Black Lives Matter, which happened in 2017, and how now it's basically come back in 2020, right? So within 3 years, in between, people just stopped talking about Black Lives Matter all of a sudden. So this article really talks about what's going on in America. Then, of course, Rachel Dolezal and the idea of being transracial. So she is that woman that I'm sure you've heard about who was actually or is actually a white woman, but she has been living as a Black woman. She was actually a college professor and everything. So I want you to read the article about it and how she tries to kind of justify it by calling it transracial. Then, of course, the really famous, because I know some of you guys love the Kardashians a lot, is Kendall Jenner's Pepsi ad. Okay, it happened a couple years ago, but it still talks to how race is seen today. So the top one is the actual commercial, if you haven't seen it, and the one below it is an article that talks about that commercial and how wrong or inappropriate that commercial is in reality when it comes to race issues. So I hope that you read these articles, take your time and enjoy this stuff because, you know, I want you to be able to talk to people about racial issues in a positive way, but also be aware of like all the controversial stuff as well. Okay. And also just wanted to say one thing, which is that you've heard me say African Americans, but then you also hear me say Black, right? And the reason why is because as Black Lives Matter has evolved, right? I've been reading a lot and there is a certain percentage of people who are African American who don't want to be called African American. They actually want to be called Black, right? They don't like the term African American. And in academia, African American is the one that's considered acceptable because it's considered like respectable or respectful, right? But it also can be seen as old or old school, right? So I use both interchangeably because I want you to know that those are the two common ones that are seen as acceptable. Depending on who you talk to, there might be a preference.